Dungeons & Dragons Online, a free-to-play MMO adaptation of the global tabletop phenomenon Dungeons & Dragons. Releasing in 2006 and undergoing a variety of alterations following its release, today we take a deep dive into its high fantasy world to see what it has to offer players today, exploring its lands and taking on its many challenges.
Oh, what's happening?
Oh, so majestic. My name's Mitch Mannix, and this is a look into Dungeons & Dragons Online in 2023, being quite frankly, staggering. As always, our journey begins at the character creator, where D&D Online, while showing its age with some dated-feeling models, also provides the player with a mind-blowing amount of options when setting up their character. 15 races, with some locked behind content packs, mainstays such as humans and incredibly baked-looking dwarves, alongside less typical options, such as half-orcs that I've never really wanted to look into the origin of, extraterrestrial-looking elves, and part-animal variants. Something about this fellow tells me you shouldn't be allowed near sharp objects. Setting up a character can be quite a daunting task, especially if you're someone who's less familiar with the mechanics around the tabletop game, with countless options for skills, stat races, and subclasses to choose from. But the game doesn't only have a highly useful rating system for solo viability, but also some predefined class setups for those that feel a little out of their depth, like me. And speaking of feeling small, it's time to begin this adventure and introduce the hero of this journey, none other than Jerobold Boopsnoot. A gnome with a desire to be a powerful and well-respected sorcerer, despite his unfortunate family name. Our tale begins incredibly abruptly ashore from a recent shipwreck, where we are introduced to Jeets, seemingly a fan of crates, and one of a small band of adventurers that walk us through a short introductory mission.
Go ahead and look around. I'm here when you're ready to go to Salimus.
Why thank you, Bicentennial Morgan Freeman, taking us through some of the basics of movement, combat, and poking Boopsnoot's enemies to death. Upon finishing the quest, we find ourselves in the game's first town, and set about seeking out its inhabitants for some initial questing, from the likes of Linus and Boulder the Bold.
Oh my god.
Dungeons & Dragons Online opts for a heavily instanced-focused gameplay loop while progressing through its levels, grabbing a quest from one of the locals and jumping straight into an instance frequently in the early hours only a few feet away for some dungeon-crawling action. This style does take away from the feeling of exploration a tad, being so condensed down, but given the multiple difficulties of each instance on offer, does work well for a quick-fire way to get into some action alone or with a group. Boopsnoot fighting diligently through some of the game's dank dungeons in the starter region, not before long being bested by a giant glacial-looking spider nonsense, and with it uncovering one of D&D Online's more interesting mechanics. Falling in combat, unlike most other MMOs, will not simply allow for a player to return from where they left off after running back to their body. In D&D Online, death as well as failing objectives can fail the quest entirely, even if the NPCs would have you thinking otherwise.
The Swahagan magic is gone,
Requiring the player to recall outside the instance to begin it from the beginning once more. And I both love and hate this setup for questing. On one hand, the chance to fail the mission through objectives or falling in battle kept me a lot more engaged in the process from quest to quest, instead of mindlessly running through objectives as with some other MMOs. On the other hand, if a player dies and you don't have a party member to pick you back up, players will either need to pay for the luxury of retrying from the place they left off with currency purchased with real cash, or restart the instance entirely. And a lot of the instances contain various bosses and puzzles to complete, so it can be really punishing for those starting out and still getting to grips with the game's nuances during its opening hours.
Oh god!
With the starter questline complete, Boopsnoot had made it to his first major settlement of the game, Stonereach Harbour, and after a quick look around, set about working through the next set of quests for his level range, conveniently provided within the Adventure Compendium. What became quite clear while doing this was the influence of the tabletop game within the MMO's character progression. Dungeons & Dragons Online continues its very detailed and complex approach to building a character for an MMO, with quite frankly a staggering amount of spells, ability trees, and even within its statistics for particular equipable items. Items and spells have alternative damage types to learn, alignment modifiers, and certain enemies have attacks that will stop players in their tracks if not understood, breaking their equipment or potatoing their character mid-fight with debuffs or even dance moves. Safe to say I spent a fair amount of time feeling quite overwhelmed by the staggering amount of information being thrown at me, and for someone less familiar with the tabletop game, required a fair amount of researching into while playing through the levels to optimize. Something I'm sure will turn some players away from the game, while also being a boon for those that take the time to learn as well as those already familiar with the core mechanics of D&D.
What the? That's my own shadow.
the gameplay loop for the next 3 to 4 levels did begin to get a little repetitive, accepting a quest from an NPC then diving straight into a very familiar looking instance, most of the time only a few feet away from the quest giver, to kill a target and possibly solve a puzzle or two, all whilst being walked through the plotline by a narrator that ranged from exciting dungeon master,
"This is Grey Garl's lost hoard. The whispering voice speaks once more. Leave now, worm."
to sounding like he had clearly been asked to come in on his day off.
By breaking the crate, you have revealed a hidden passageway.
But it has to be said the narration overall really did add to the experience, often being helpful, offering additional information, as well as selling that D&D feel. Boopsnoot, with a number of levels under his belt, set out to learn about the game's crafting, picking up a quest from a chap looking like he was busting for the bathroom and visiting one of the zone's crafting areas. Crafting in D&D Online, outside of creating traps for rogues, can be summarized more like what most other MMOs cover in their enchanting profession. That being that most crafting in the game is centered around upgrading and augmenting gear after providing a base item found while adventuring, being a far cry from the more in-depth systems we've come to know in more recent times, and even from before its 2006 release. D&D Online may be one to consider carefully for those that jump into MMOs with a mission to make crafting and gathering their go-to activity. But it has to be said the crafting area did have some pretty quirky music to jam out to whilst busying yourself, reminding me a little bit of A Clockwork Orange along with a number of other things. Sir, you seem to be levitating.
I know! It all happened after I dropped a like on the video and wrote a comment with my thoughts. I tell you what, mate, if I knew this would happen after subscribing to that mad funny bloke on the internet, I would have done it ages ago. I'm bloody levitating.
After spending a whole lot of time in and around Stonereach, Boopsnoot looked to expand his horizons further out into the game's world, and looked to at rank 12 set his sights on some quests further afield. D&D Online currently has a level cap of 32, and to expand out from that, along with its expanded levels after reaching cap called Epic Destiny, chooses to add 5 ranks of progression to each level, essentially spreading out the leveling to accommodate for the lower than typical leveling cap. Reaching level 7, for example, actually being made up of 32 level ranks, a number a lot closer to what you might expect from the amount of time played. With rank 12 obtained, we spent some final moments taking in the sights of Stonereach, taking part in what I assume was a jumping puzzle, giving me flashbacks of last Halloween.
Right, okay, I'm sorry. It's the yellow one. It's excelente, muy bien. Okay, oh god, oh. Listen. Like, oh my god. Oh, dear mood! What?
Boopsnoot ventured out to some of the game's more varied environments, which was a nice change after the seemingly endless amount of dark sewers leading up to this point. The wider expanses of Dungeons & Dragons Online aren't exactly brimming with alternative activities, but do contain additional quests, as well as a set of tasks to complete within a certain zone. After some exploration, accepting a quest requiring us to infiltrate an orc encampment, and it was nice to see some variety finally, even if some of the zone changes going from night to day were a bit on the jarring side. It was the levels around level 5 where the game opened up not only in its own variety, but in, for me at least, how enjoyable the moment-to-moment gameplay became. As would be expected with a small toolset available, the very linear, condensed dungeon running felt quite repetitive quite quickly. But once Boopsnoot started getting a much larger arsenal, mixed in with a few elements to spice up the dungeons themselves, such as skeletal mages that will curse you into submission on sight, and taking on locations with immunities to my offensive school of choice, really started showcasing the benefits of having a much more complex and detailed MMORPG rule set. Having to plan out my loadout to accommodate for particular enemies, or plan ahead on how to tackle a pack of mobs, while all the while feeling the pressure of knowing failure would come at a cost, brought the game to life after what felt like an endless journey through the same locations.
Oh, I'm sorry, am I interrupting something?
Exploring tombs and catacombs, fire caves and spooky environments. Boop even had a quest that was such a close call that he reached its end after running out of healing items with just 4 HP to spare. We even got a chance to try out the game's companion system.
Yep, that's definitely Boop's companion, alright.
That held more utility than I was expecting, being able to order them around as well as use them in combat, even sometimes assisting in solving some of the game's puzzles. When it comes to the more traditional grouping up, each instance can be taken on with a group as well as options to increase the difficulty. Boop did manage to gather up some compatriots a couple of times, which did have varying levels of success, but for the most part when looking for a group before starting a particular instance, was met with an endless queue, most likely due to the game's modest population. In my time reaching level 7 rank 32, taking on countless single and multi-tiered questlines, getting a chance to visit a number of the game's larger areas, along with flushing out my pint-sized sorcerer, I can say that this game will most likely not do a lot to appeal over the competition to most of today's contemporary MMO audience. The game itself feels massively dated, not only in its sometimes painfully repetitive gameplay loops, but also in its animations and movement, and its sometimes invisible clown car feeling habit of spawning NPCs. Questing in D&D Online can feel like a step down from the more grand-feeling contemporary offerings, and the complexity of some of its systems, mixed with its often poor attempts at explaining them, I'm sure will also lead to players turning away from the title. But for those that are looking for a more slowed-down experience, that have the patience to learn about its mechanics, and are a fan of the more old-school feeling MMORPG experience, could get a huge amount of enjoyment from this title. During the early hours, the game felt like a grind, but once I began unlocking some more powerful spells, and really getting into the swing of how to kit out my magic-wielding sork, began to feel a lot more engaging. Even stepping into one of the epic challenge dungeons and coming out on top felt really rewarding, in a way that a lot of MMO's early game at least are unable to reach. Not just that, but it's slightly less worked through elements, sometimes injecting some unintentional humour.
Okay, that has to be the crappiest attempt at hiding behind something I have ever seen.
With the game being free to play, a fair amount of the game's content is locked behind content packs and premium membership, and after trying the game both with a sub and not, did have to replay the same quests a number of times when playing without the premium subscription to level up. Additional content packs of raids, dungeons and questlines are available from the shop, alongside one of the most hilariously blatant examples of pay-for-power transactions, literally labelled as allows you to make more powerful characters, which I have to applaud for its barefaced description. As with developers Standing Stone's other MMO offering, Lord of the Rings Online, if you're not a fan of the slower pace of a more old-school feeling MMORPG experience, then it's unlikely that you'll get the most out of Dungeons & Dragons Online. But for those that do and have the patience to get to grips with its staggering amount of D&D focused stats and mechanics, in comparison to most other MMOs, could really get a chance at some highly rewarding, classic role-playing feeling adventures.
You cheeky bastard.
Thank you so much for watching. Have you played D&D Online? Either way, I'm keen to get your thoughts down in the comments. I want to give a massive shout out to the channel members who help in supporting the channel and keeping the content coming. If you're interested in joining the channel as a member for all sorts of perks including exclusive videos, the info is down in the description. Please drop the video a like if you enjoyed it and subscribe for oh so much more. And I will see you guys in the next one.
Jesus, calm down.
Oh dear Lord, what have I done?